I'm Mike Graham, and this is Putin's War, a weekly update on what's going on in Ukraine, how Russia is developing its next strategy, and how the West is actually dealing with all of it. I'm joined today once more by our expert Cormac Smith, a man that's worked with the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry for many, many years, and a man who knows a thing or two about what's happening on the ground. Cormac, welcome. Thanks
Mike,
for joining us once again.
Nice to see you again.
Quite a lot has happened since the last time you and I spoke. We've had Vladimir Zelensky in London. We've had commitments from the British military. I'm hearing from people who know about strategy in the region that the Russians are preparing for a pretty big military push over the next month, maybe two. What can you tell us about that?
Well, yes, they are, Mike. And, you know, the Ukrainians, before anyone had been warning us about this, both General Valery Zaluzny, the head of the general staff, and also Alexei Reznikov, their Minister of Defense, have been warning us since before Christmas that they believed that the Russians were preparing for a major offensive early in the new year, you know, to coincide with the anniversary. Anniversaries being very important. Now, we believe that they are preparing anything between 200 and 500,000 conscripts to throw into the meat grinder. Right. And, you know, these will be troops that will be, you know, far less well trained, less well equipped, certainly less disciplined and motivated than the Ukrainian counterparts.
And pretty hurriedly kind of moved, presumably.
Yes. So, you know, unfortunately, Russia has form on this. They have no compunction, and Putin certainly hasn't any compunction with throwing tens of thousands of his own people into the meat grinder. Yeah. But, you know, one of the concerns that came out of the Ramstein format meetings earlier was the Ukrainians are literally running out of ammunition, and the Western allies are running out of ammunition. So there's a great need now for the Western allies to put their arms industries on more of a war footing so we can keep supplying the Ukrainians with the
So the conversations that were being had before in London and in Paris and in Brussels when Zelensky was visiting have been sort of augmented, haven't they, by Ben Wallace, the Secretary of State for Defence, other Secretary of States for Defence in European countries. But the supply promise is all very well, but is the supply there?
Well, we are seeing progress, and, you know, Ben Wallace has been more solid than anyone on this, and I've said before, I believe Ben Wallace has been the absolute, you know, steel in the spine of the Allies and behind the British support consistently. But you know, there was unanimity in the recent Ramstein format meetings, which was the meetings of ministers of defence. There is clearly a commitment to produce more ammunition. Britain, for example, is talking about working in partnership with the Ukrainians to produce ammunition in Ukraine. Ukraine has traditionally had quite a big armaments industry. So we're getting there. We're getting there with the tanks. We're getting there with the longer range artillery. The third heavy weapon system that the Ukrainians need, the jets, is clearly this commitment, but it's going to take a lot longer. And the problem is, for every delay there is on this, that delay is paid in Ukrainian blood.
And as far as the Russian sort of military manoeuvres are concerned, people are saying to me that they'll give it a time limit simply and purely because they're quite happy with what they've got. They'd like to have more land, but if they can't get it, and if the next sort of offensive doesn't work, they'll just sit back and maintain a presence in the areas they have control of and just kind of wait and see what then happens.
Well, you know, Mike, I think Russia has had to revise their expectations very significantly over the last year. We heard all about the blitzkrieg that was going to take Kyiv and decapitate the Ukrainian government within 72 hours. Russia miscalculated the strength and the will of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian armed forces. But they also, I think, they massively underestimated the resolve and the unity that NATO countries have shown. They simply didn't think that NATO would show up because, quite frankly, when they invaded in 2014, we didn't show up in the West, much I believe to our shame.
Yes, and indeed the same in Georgia, right?
Exactly. You know, I've said this before. We probably should have done something in 2008 when Georgia was invaded. We most definitely should have done something in 2014 when Crimea was illegally annexed and the Donbass was invaded.
Yes.
We effectively sat on our hands. We put some sanctions in place. That was a red rag to a bull to Putin, because the one thing that's going to antagonize Putin is not strength, it's weakness.
Yes, and he's had some support this week from Belarus, hasn't he?
Well, I think it's interesting to consider. Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, who is one of Putin's main allies, has said interestingly that they will only get involved in fighting if Belarusian territory is invaded and their people are killed. So I think Lukashenko is in a very difficult position. I have no doubt that Lukashenko wants to support Putin, but he does not. There is a far stronger democracy movement among the Belarusian people than there is among the Russian people, and I think Lukashenko has far less grip over his own people than Putin does over the Russian people. So I think it's difficult. Certainly attacks are being launched and will continue to be launched from Belarus. But I think we need to watch that one closely. I think people have expressed doubts whether there is even the will to fight in the Belarusian army, whether there has been speculation that units might even desert and go over to fight on the Ukrainian side if push came to shove.
And what's been happening in Moscow? How's Putin reacted to the Zelensky kind of tour of Western Europe, if you like? What's he said? He doesn't appear to have done anything particularly outlandish as a result.
No, we get the same rhetoric repeated all the time. That is when we announce that we're going to give them battle tanks, they ridiculously say that every Western weapon that's sent to Ukraine will be destroyed by the great Russian army and so forth. One of the lessons that we have learned from this, we believed a year ago that Russia was the second most powerful military force on the face of the earth. We believed they had a standing army of 1 million because that's what we were told. It's very clear that Putin does not have the army that he sees in Red Square or that we saw on paper. Our own Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, said only earlier this week that he believes 97% of Russia's army is committed to Ukraine. This is why they're emptying their prisons. This is why they're calling up hundreds of thousands of conscripts. They haven't gone to general mobilization yet, which is the ultimate step. But the reason they will not have done that is, I think, they would fear what that would mean in society, and there is even limits to how far Putin can push his own people.
Yes, and so the standoff continues effectively. We're entering, I suppose, reasonably spring-like weather over there, so it's going to be a tough couple of months by the sounds of it.
It's going to be a very, very tough couple of months. I mean, we are going to get some would say that the new year offensive has started already. We are no doubt going to see hundreds of thousands of more conscripts thrown into this. My own judgment is that Ukraine will prevail. It will be at very, very significant cost, Mike. And of course, I think, given that, as I said, Putin has had to revise his expectations, I think now what he will be looking for is to gain and hold as much land as possible, while at the same time pushing for negotiations. The Ukrainians really have no interest in that. Their starting point is driving Russia back to the internationally recognized borders of 1991, which includes Donbass and includes taking Crimea.
Yes, and so they see no settlement really in their future at all until Russia gets out of their country.
Exactly, whereas for Putin, a frozen war would suit him very well because it will give him breathing space and it will give him time to rebuild. And remember, Putin will play a long game. He will play a game over years. He has made it very, very clear that he wants to put the Russian Empire back together. There is no Russian Empire without Ukraine, and he does not believe that Ukraine has a right to exist as an independent, sovereign country.
Serious stuff. Cormac, thank you very much indeed. Cormac Smith there with the latest from Putin's war. It's still going on. It's not going to go away anytime soon, and it's going to get tougher for an awful lot of people. This is Mike Graham for Talk TV. It's the embassy of Mike Graham. More coming next week.